Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngwin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngwin Kim.
Today I'm pleased to have on the episode Dr. Grace Inae Blum, who is an Associate Professor of Curriculum and Instruction-ELL/Bilingual Education at Seattle Pacific University. Her experiences as a daughter of first-generation Korean immigrants, mother to two school-age biracial children, and former P-12 adult literacy educator greatly inform her commitments toward culturally sustaining teaching, scholarship, and service. Dr. Blum has worked in a variety of educational settings. Prior to her work as a teacher educator, she was an elementary school teacher, having worked in both bilingual and mainstream classrooms in public schools in the greater Chicagoland and Los Angeles areas. She has also worked as an adult literacy/ESL educator both in immigrant communities in the US and in northern Iraq. Most recently, Dr. Blum was an assistant professor of early childhood/elementary/TESL-Bilingual Education at Central Washington University. Her current research interests include humanizing teacher education, teacher preparation for culturally and linguistically diverse classrooms, and the recruitment and retention of BIPOC educators. Grace, welcome.
Thank you, Paul.
It's so good to have you. And I know that in our previous conversations, we've talked about multilingual education, and within that, this idea of translanguaging came up, which really fascinated me. So let's start there and have you talk about what is translanguaging and why is it needed in a multilingual classroom?
So I have found it really helpful to think about translanguaging. Scholars have written about translanguaging as not just a theory, but also a pedagogy. And so let me unpack that a little bit. So translanguaging is a theory that assumes that bilingual or multilingual learners, they operate from a unified set or system of language features that draws upon language features from their knowledges of the multiple languages in which they're familiar with. And so what that looks like pedagogically or what, in terms of pedagogy in the classroom is educators can set up spaces where students that are bilingual or multilingual can access their entire linguistic repertoire to be able to make sense and to make meaning out of the context in which they're speaking in and working in and living in. And so this has been a really helpful theory in understanding how to set up affirming classroom spaces for bilingual, multilingual learners where they are seen and valued for all of the funds of knowledge and funds of linguistic knowledge that they bring into the classroom. So where they're valued from an asset perspective as opposed to a deficit perspective. And so I'll start with that and then we can talk a little bit more about some of the details of translanguaging pedagogy and theory.
I love what you shared about the positive or asset-focused perspective instead of a deficit perspective, because I think in multicultural education and certainly in multicultural psychology, I think we tend to have focused on a deficit perspective, right? And how it's all about catching up certain students to the standard. And I think in contrast, what you're saying is we view the students' contributions as assets, as another guest on the podcast called it like community wealth, where they're bringing in what is really valuable from their community into the classroom. So I really appreciated that perspective. I'm familiar with also the idea of code switching, and in psychology we also use the term alternation to refer to the idea of multicultural individuals switching between different types of settings, alternating, if you will, between different cultures. And so could you say a bit about how translanguaging is different from something like code switching?
This is a common question and a common misconception, misunderstanding, because oftentimes these ideas get intermingled and used interchangeably when they're talking about and expressing different things. But they're definitely interrelated, and in such that I have found some definitions offered by, there's some scholars that make their scholarship public on TikTok and YouTube. and two of whom I've learned quite a bit from. One is Jose Medina, and another one is Mike Mina, and they both have these lovely videos that they've uploaded that talk specifically about the differences between translanguaging and code switching in very accessible everyday language, which I really appreciate. And one of the ways in which Mike Mina in particular describes the difference of translanguaging and code switching is that code switching is often describing this sort of phenomenon of moving between languages from an external perspective, whereas translanguaging, and this is building upon, so I want to also give credit not just to Mike Mina, but also to Dr. Ophelia Garcia, Li Wei, and others that have really done a lot of the theoretical heavy lifting to build out this understanding of translanguaging. But translanguaging really speaks from the bilingual or the multilingual learner's internal perspective. And so I know, Paul, you identify as a multilingual yourself. I know you speak Korean and English. I don't know if there are other languages also that you are familiar with. But as a multilingual learner, not but this is what we do. We're not necessarily thinking about this is my Korean half of the brain, this is my English half of the brain, or even other languages or different registers. Like we have this unified operating system, and we're constantly making sense and making meaning using all of the different features of what are these named languages of Korean and English that we've acquired that we've learned over time. And so translanguaging really speaks to what is happening internally, what's happening inside the multilingual learner's brain. Whereas code switching really speaks and identifies as languages as distinctive codes, which are named externally, right? Like what is Korean, what is English, and separates these into these separate language systems. And so oftentimes what you hear a bilingual or multilingual learner doing is they are code switching as defined by they're navigating, as you're saying, they're perhaps intermingling words from one language into another language. And so they, I speak Konglish all the time. I grew up in a Korean American house where constantly I was communicating with my parents, weaving in and out using language features from the Korean language and from the English language. And that could be considered code switching from that external perspective. I'm taking these language features from these named languages and using them interchangeably to communicate. But again, translanguaging speaks to what's really happening. I'm not thinking about actively like, oh, I'm going to use this Korean word and this English word to be able to communicate this with my mom about this particular thing. I'm drawing on all of the linguistic knowledge, that full linguistic repertoire that draws upon my understanding of these named languages to be able to make sense of the situation or to be able to communicate in that social situation. And so I think the main distinction that's been helpful for me, again, as articulated by Mike Mina and others, is thinking about translanguaging more from the sort of internal perspective of what's happening inside of the multilingual learner, the bilingual learner's brain, and code switching as a description of what multilingual learners are doing when they are taking aspects of these named languages or nation languages and again mixing them, or as you said, using them, intermeshing them. I can't remember the word that you used that's in psychology, but again,
alternating, right?
Alternating, right, in order to communicate. So that's a very helpful distinction for me to think about more as from the insider perspective versus the external perspective. But also with code switching, we know even monolingual learners code switch all the time, right? And code switching the definition as applied by linguists is oftentimes different or has changed in ways in which, like, the term code switching used is just in common everyday society. And so we code switch all of the time when we're in a particular language, whether we're at work in a more professional setting or we're at home, or whether we're talking to our pets. We're constantly code switching within a particular language, but that's a little bit different, right? But we're still using markers within the sort of named language. Translanguaging goes beyond that, again, where it's not necessarily about these named languages, but allowing learners and multilingual learners, bilingual learners to be able to communicate, drawing upon their understanding of all of the linguistic features that are not necessarily even tied to particular named languages, if that makes sense at all.
Totally. Yeah, this is really helpful for me to think about the external versus internal dimensions. And maybe this is kind of extending it even further. So feel free to correct me, Grace, if this is not sort of how you see things. But
Yeah.
As you were talking, I also thought about how code switching, which is a valid way of sort of culturally adapting, but it's also in some ways kind of setting aside a part of who you are to adjust to the current situation. Like when I go into work, there's a code switching that occurs that kind of puts aside my particular identities or identities and really adapts to that mainstream culture. Whereas translanguaging, it looks more like maybe accepting the whole student, right? Accepting the whole person, including their internal ways of processing things in a way that, to me, sounds really attractive, really good for educators to do. Is that sort of making sense to you in terms of how I'm extending what you're sharing?
Yes, yes. And I'm really glad that you added that because I don't know that I articulated that well in my initial definition of translanguaging pedagogy. Because part of your initial question to me is like, why is it needed in the classroom? Because translanguaging in and of itself is, again, not just a theory, but it can be a liberating pedagogy. To your point, with code switching, we're constantly having to assimilate, right? Why do we code switch? Oftentimes is to assimilate into that social situation. But a lot of these named languages are tied to power. We're oftentimes having to assimilate into a particular context in order to fit in or to be appropriate in whatever sort of that cultural context and that named cultural context is. And so embracing students' full or language learners or my multilingual learners' full linguistic repertoire allows them to draw on those resources. It doesn't mean that they have to assimilate, or it doesn't say that they have to accommodate or code switch, but all of those linguistic resources, their ability to code switch, their ability to go back and forth, the ability to translanguage research talks about this idea of corriente. It's like this current, this idea of moving language. The fact that they can language as a verb, that is that is a superpower. I've seen posters that say multilingualism, bilingualism is a superpower. That's a lot of cognitive labor, cognitive work between to be able to navigate and to be able to language like that. And so to your point, I think translanguaging is a liberating pedagogy. It works in ways where students can bring their full identity, all of themselves, all of their expertise, all of their funds of knowledge into the classroom, and that's embraced. And that's not seen as a deficit, like, oh, that person isn't speaking English fluently, or that person has a misunderstanding or doesn't know that word in this particular language. But it affirms that students bring lots of different kinds of knowledge into the classroom and that those are welcomed and embraced and valued. And I really love the highlighting that it is a dignifying, it is a affirming, culturally sustaining way to serve our students.
I love how you're saying that it's an empowering process, that it's a dignifying process. So thank you for sharing that. I know you have lots of examples, but if you feel comfortable, can you share an example of something that would be described or depicted as a translanguaging process, something that a student might do in the classroom? Yeah, I know, again, you have lots of examples based on your experience, but maybe one example.
Yeah, yeah. When we first had our initial conversations around translanguaging,
Yeah.
we were talking a lot about these ideas that are very important to you and your work and that you're working on right now, these of Han and Chung and these things that I have often found are really difficult to describe in the English language. Just identifying as a Korean American, familiar with these constructs and these understandings, I don't know that there's one concise word to capture that the essence of even what that is. And in our initial conversation talking about those ideas, I shared with you one example and I really wanted to bring it and I just kind of ran out of time this morning. But I share an example oftentimes with my students because it's something that's close to my heart. One of my favorite fruits, and it's because my mom just loves them so much, is a persimmon. When we were younger, it was really hard to find persimmon. You could only find them at like Asian markets at H Mart. But now you can go into any Safeway or Whole Foods and you can find usually two different kinds of persimmon. And so there's I think hachia and fuyu persimmons that you can usually find in the stores. And one of them, which is the hachia type of persimmon, it looks kind of like a teardrop. That is my favorite fruit. And my mom loves that fruit too. And that fruit, if you don't eat it when it is ripe, there's a particular phenomenon that I asked you about, right? And there's a particular word in Korean that captures that experience, and it's tulba, right? Or tulba as the description of what
Yeah.
that phenomenon is when you eat like a really unripe persimmon. And I've always looked for an English word to capture that same phenomenon. And the closest I've come to is like cottonmouth or astringent, but it doesn't really capture it exactly. Those are close, but not quite that. That's a silly example, but that's a very real example in my own life of something that I
Right?
have to translanguage in order to make sense of that situation and actually in order to be able to communicate with that. And so I know we're on a podcast and I know that we know each other professionally mostly, but as Korean Americans, like I Konglish all the time. So if I were to tell this story
Mm,
or, to my parents, or if I were, just talking with you casually in a more social setting, I would probably be translanguaging and telling you about that. One thing that and I'll just break
right.
into that. So just kind of break the third wall a little
Yeah.
bit. One of the things that my mom told me to do to get rid of that third wall feeling in the come is to olio it. If you
Mm.
olio it for like overnight
Oh.
and then you defrost it,
Mm-hmm.
it'll take away that third wall
Oh.
feeling of the persimmon, of the come. So that's very
Mm.
natural to me, right? Like I'm constantly, like that's
Yeah.
just how I'm thinking of communicating, and I'm communicating to you. You have an understanding of all of that because you translanguage
Right.
yourself. But in that description, I'm describing to you a particular thing. For in this
Yeah.
situation, describing that necessitates me to be able to do that in order to be able to communicate effectively. What I'm trying to describe to you is this phenomenon when I'm
Right.
eating this
Right.
persimmon. And what my mom
Yeah.
has told me to do, if you put it in the freezer overnight and then defrost it, it'll take away some of that turba feeling. So that's an example
Mm.
that I share oftentimes with my students with pictures. If I came better prepared, I would have brought actual persimmons to show you. But that's one way to just kind of make that visible, that sort of more theoretical understanding of translanguaging to students. But I'll tell you, Paul, in my classrooms, when there are bilingual or multilingual learners in the classroom, they're all familiar with it because this is what bilingual learners we do. We're not thinking in a particular language, but we're constantly making sense of the world using all of our linguistic knowledge, all our full linguistic
Right.
repertoire. So a lot of times my students will have
Mm. Mm.
stories or they'll have anecdotes about how they're translanguaging in their everyday lives to make connections with what we're talking about. Also, this is a really silly example, but I'm teaching my first undergraduate course that's just solely focused on supporting multilingual learners in the gen ed classroom. It's a new class we added, the SPU. And I'm really excited because I just stumbled upon these TikTok videos of this golden retriever. I know it sounds absolutely ridiculous, but his name is Chilakil. But Chilakil translanguages like no other that I've seen before. And he really draws, I mean, his owners draw on his
Yeah.
knowledge of Spanish and English and is constantly translanguaging in this really humorous, just charming, lovely way. So I plan on showing some of Chilaquil's videos in my class for them to see some more representations, especially for those that are not multilingual, so they can see some examples of real translanguaging, real time. So Chilaquil is a great example. There's lots of great examples of how to understand translanguaging theory and then in the classroom. I'm also happy to share some ways in which, like you mentioned in the bio, most of my teaching is centered on preparing future teachers. And I think it's important for them not
Yeah.
to understand just the theory, but then also to model ways in which they can translanguage with their students and set up classroom spaces for their future students that will allow their bilingual and multilingual learners to be able to translanguage. So I'll share some examples of
Mm.
how we might do that. I'll encourage my own bilingual, multilingual students to translanguage in their writing, in their communication in the classroom.
Mm.
Yeah, that's just some ways in which that I'm thinking about how to do that in particular in this class, but also how to introduce this pedagogical approach and this theoretical approach to my
Yeah.
students. And I will add,
Mm.
my training when I went through English language learner teacher preparation years ago, translanguaging was not a part of the conversation. It's more of a recent theoretical construct and again pedagogical ideas that have accompanied it that have come across probably in the last 10 years or so. And so it was not a part of my own training. And I appreciate how the field has sort of moved us in this direction towards really affirming students' full linguistic repertoires and honoring the home languages and honoring the importance of validating and also sustaining that type of
Yeah.
knowledge that students bring into the classroom.
That's super important. And I mean, you're giving me another reason to consider getting on TikTok. My students they've been encouraging me to get on TikTok, but I've so far resisted. But I think TikTok has maybe some hidden resources, like you said, that we could tap into.
This is a total tangent, right? Not necessarily related to
Mm.
translanguaging, but I think it takes a lot talking about different types of knowledge and skill to take something that can be very theoretical, very, heady, and to be able to communicate it in a concise, understandable way to the everyday audience in a way that's engaging. And so I originally got onto TikTok just to be able to track what my daughter was into and what she was watching. But I've learned quite a bit from scholars that are making their scholarship public, just in many ways in which you're doing, in ways that are accessible. It's kind of breaking that sort of ivory tower inaccessibility, and I love that. There's a lot of garbage on TikTok too. There's a lot of things that you have to weed through, but there are folks that are sharing their scholarship. I don't think Chila the golden retriever, is intending to make videos about translanguaging. I don't know that he's realizing the gift that he's giving probably to my academic community. But there are a lot of scholars that are using TikTok in ways in which that are sharing their scholarship, making it more accessible, which I really do appreciate. And it takes a lot of skill to do that. It's not easy. So it seems like a silly platform in a lot of ways, but I've learned a lot from scholars, especially like the two that I shared, Mike Mina and Jose Medina, that make their scholarship so accessible and understandable.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's get to that question that you mentioned, which is about teaching about teaching. And the part that really excites me about having you on the podcast is you're someone who educates educators. And I think you might be like the second or third person who's in education that I have featured on this podcast. And I have so much respect for those who are engaged in scholarship of teaching. And so I'm curious about how you teach students about translanguaging. Like, what would be an example of an exercise or a pedagogical tool that you use to teach students about how to do translanguaging? You mentioned like setting up that climate in the classroom, the teacher modeling translanguaging themselves. But could you say a bit more about how you teach about translanguaging?
Yeah, so I think some of that starts with just kind of introducing, like very much so like we did today, a conversation around translanguaging theory and some of the origins of that, and then how that has translated into what it looks like in the classroom, into actually some pedagogical strategies that our students can take up and share with their own future students of bilingual, multilingual students. So how do I teach that? Again, is showing them some visual representations of what translanguaging looks like and giving them lots of different examples of that. So I might share my persimmon example as one in which that I
Yeah.
translanguage, and then I might invite other multilingual students to share their experiences about how they translanguage in order to make sense of social context in which they navigate. Also, creating experiences where they can translanguage themselves in the classroom in a scaffolded, safe way. So, in the classroom, again, I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to allow my students to be able to translanguage in some of the activities that we're doing, whether it's in their writing, whether it's in how they're communicating in the classroom, in classroom discussions, that they don't necessarily have to your point, like assimilate or have to be able to code switch in order to find themselves to be socially appropriate in the context of our class. And so the giving students the freedom to be able to translanguage, whether they're monolingual or whether they're multilingual, to give them that freedom and that choice to be able to do that in classroom activities. So for them to actually be able to experience what that feels like as learners in the classroom, and then therefore to be able to think about how to cultivate spaces in their own future classrooms of students, of how am I going to do this when I have students that come from all these different linguistic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. How am I going to cultivate a space in which I can allow my students to fully embrace their linguistic repertoire? And so might that mean having anchor charts on the walls where I offer students the opportunity to share different definitions of words. Oftentimes, if you'll go into an elementary classroom, you'll see the walls papered with anchor charts. And anchor charts are charts that are usually on the wall that students can go to access, information that acts as an anchor, right? There's lots of different purposes for anchor charts, but vocabulary words comes to mind right now. And maybe it's giving your students the option to write those same words in their own home language or the language that's spoken with their family, and giving them that opportunity, but it's visible and it's welcome and it's a part of the classroom space. That might be one like practical example of doing that. But allowing your students to translanguage, right? Respond to this particular prompt in a way that makes sense to you. And so giving them the opportunity in higher ed to be able to do that, to be able to translanguage in their writing, in the way they're communicating in the context of the class. That's one thing that I'm really looking forward to, is inviting students to be able to translanguage in the way that they're communicating in some of the classroom activities that we do in class, and welcoming that and affirming that. And I think I'm anticipating that's going to be a little strange, to be honest, at first, because that's not necessarily how many of us have navigated higher ed or formal schooling at all, really. And so to be able to welcome that and allow students to really fully embrace that, and that is something
Yeah.
that I'm going to encourage, I think that might be a little bit uncomfortable at first, but Seltzer and Ophelia Garcia, they talk quite a bit about when they unpack translanguaging pedagogy and what it looks like in the classroom. It starts with the translanguaging stance. It's sort of your orientation towards this. It's not just the activities and the details, but it's the
Right.
values. It's that you're valuing multilingualism. You're taking a stance that this matters, that your linguistic expertise matters, and it's welcome here. And so I think that's an important part that I hope to share with my students, to pass that on, and so they could also pass that on and cultivate spaces like that for their
Yeah.
own future students.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point about that posture being important for that safe space, that hospitable space to be created. So, yeah, I think that stance that you're speaking of is really critical. I want to go back to your Durable example, if you don't mind. And
Yeah.
I know you answered a part of this, but like if you were my student in my class and you wrote in a paper about that Durable experience without giving me that detailed explanation that you gave me on this episode, from your perspective, what is a good way for the teacher to engage that, for a teacher to respond, who might not know or have any idea what Darbo means, but now the student has used that term in a paper to describe an experience? How would you suggest that that teacher then engage that or respond to that?
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming that's coming from a place and a space where that translanguaging stance is welcome and valued. And so hopefully the teacher will not be completely thrown off that that's a part of their
Right.
articulation of whatever the assignment objectives were. So coming from that sort of stance is, there's oftentimes a misconception too. And I work again in a program where we're working towards preparing teacher candidates to work with multilingual learners, to work with English language learners in gen ed context. And so oftentimes these students, or my students, are not bilingual, are not bilingual. Actually, the majority of teacher candidates, not just in our program here at SPU, but across the United States, are white women. That's been the case for many years. It still continues to be the case, although the teaching force has been it's much more diverse now than it has been before. It's still overwhelmingly white and monolingual. And so teacher candidates such as this example, they might not come from a multilingual background where they immediately identify, oh, that student is translanguaging. They are using their full linguistic repertoire to communicate this very complicated thing. They might, if they're not coming from that perspective or that translanguaging stance or that value, they're looking at that like, they're seeing that as a deficit. Like, wait, this student did not know the right word to use in this particular context. So they're using this word from a language that we're not speaking here at school to be able to communicate this. They might see that as an error, and they might see that as something that's wrong or a deficiency in that student's ability to communicate. When in fact, all that we unpacked, it's pretty sophisticated, right? What they're doing is to be able to appropriately
Yeah.
place. It takes a deep understanding of, wait, that's a descriptive word. That's an adjective that I'm using appropriately in this context, even when we're describing this example. And so there's a lot of metalinguistic awareness. We talk about critical medical linguistic awareness, how that's happening with our translingual students that are translanguaging. And so that's what that student is showing me in that particular example, and that it's not a deficit, it's not an error, but they have some deep metalinguistic awareness that they are activating and using in order to be able to appropriately communicate this. And so monolingual learners and we that might not even be familiar with a particular language, there are so many tools now that can help us understand. And so I might even easily throw that into Google Translate if I was an educator. It's like, oh wait, what is that
Mm.
that student used just to
Mm-hmm.
make sense of that? And then that would help me. It's like, oh my goodness, my student is translanguaging in this context. That gives me a deeper understanding of what is happening here. So again, coming from that translanguaging stance, I would welcome a student's contribution such like that and see that as an example of, oh, my student is really demonstrating this metalinguistic awareness in being able to communicate in this
Right.
way. And then as an instructor, I would, again, I don't need to know all the languages that are represented in my classroom in order to
Right.
effectively educate multilingual learners in the classroom. We as educators have many, many tools that we can access and use to be able to understand our students and to serve them well. And also, I would pull that student aside and, tell me more and draw on our students' expertise. I think oftentimes, Pablo Freire talks about this banking model of education where students are seen as these empty vessels that know nothing, and the teacher is the expert that's depositing knowledge and information and into these empty vessels, when that's not who our students are, right? He
Mm.
talks, Freire
Right.
encourages us to move towards developing a critical consciousness among our students and to really thinking of them from an asset perspective, thinking about all of the expertise that they bring into the classroom, and even children, right? They have so much valuable expertise that they can share in the classroom, seeing them as experts, honoring their knowledge and linguistic knowledge. To your point, I would pull that student aside, like, tell me more. What does this mean? What does thermal mean? And I would ask them to share with me their expertise, and that would, develop my understanding of them better, which is a really important tenet of we've talked about in other spaces of culturally relevant teaching, culturally responsive teaching, is to really know your students. If a student were, again, to kind of translanguage in that way in an assignment, I would invite them to share their expertise, to tell me more, give me a little bit more context if I didn't have that understanding. I would love to have a Korean American student to talk about that with in that context. I would love to come across an assignment like that if that ever came up. But yeah, and we'll see. Maybe that'll happen when I
Yeah.
encourage the students to translanguage in their activities.
Grace, what you're sharing reminded me of what we talk about in counseling or psychotherapy literature about what it means to practice in a multiculturally competent way. Like when you're sitting with a client who is from a different cultural background than you, what is your responsibility as a therapist? And we often talk about how, as therapists, we can't know in detail about every single client's background, right? But we do have a responsibility to ask the right questions and to follow up with the resources that are available to us to be able to understand a particular client's perspective, a particular client's experience that we need to do the research on. So what you shared reminded me of that, and how translanguaging is not this passive stance on the part of the teacher that says, oh, all language is welcome and I don't need to really engage. You just need to bring in whatever language that you speak at home, but rather it's a very active, curious, exploratory kind of an approach that really empowers the student. Yeah, so thank you for sharing. I think you've made a strong case that translanguaging is really important for DEI and belonging. I also want to talk about Christian faith because this is something that, as you know, my listeners are very much interested in. And so how do you connect this idea of translanguaging to your own Christian faith?
Yeah, I think this is a really poignant and pertinent question because I've been thinking about this quite a lot. And when I first started thinking about this, actually a little over a year ago, I stumbled across this research paper. And I say stumble because it's funny. I just did a simple Google Scholar search, and I think the initial terms were translanguaging and faith. And then I started with like linguistically
Mm.
responsive teaching, which is something that I've been thinking quite a bit about, this idea of linguistically responsive teaching. So I think I put actually linguistic responsive teaching first and faith together in my Google search, and then I went looked at translanguaging and faith, and I think my linguistically responsive teaching search led me to a paper that actually the School of Education at SPU, the dean, wrote several years ago
Mm.
called "Culturally Responsive Teaching." ... For the Bible tells me so. I stumbled upon it because she's the School of Ed dean, and I see her and work with her quite a bit, but I had no idea that she had written this paper. She basically unpacks the tenets of culturally responsive teaching, culturally relevant teaching, and there have been years and years of work and scholarship that have focused on the importance of culturally relevant, culturally sustaining teaching in education and in teacher education in particular. She connects a lot of the core tenets of culturally relevant teaching that are, again, based in this scholarship that's not necessarily tightly connected to faith, or integrated with that, but she connects it with passages in the scripture that justify the importance of embracing who God has created us to be, and especially the diversity of God's people. And she's made connections with really specific scripture and stories from the Bible and stories from the Gospels that justify the importance of culturally relevant teaching. And so I was really struck by that piece, and that got me thinking again, for thinking about how language is such an important aspect of culture, right? You can't untie those, right? Language is so intricately tied to culture. And so in so many of the ways in which she used that paper to justify the importance of culturally sustaining teaching, those same stories, those same sort of verses in the Bible also support why linguistically responsive teaching. And again, another iteration of that would be like translanguaging, or another move rather, like would be that all of these support the full embracing of culture in which language is such an important part of. And translanguaging, like we've talked already, is in terms of the stance, in terms of also the practical pedagogical approach in the classroom, is a way where we can fully embrace our students and who God has created them to be, that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, that their perhaps lack of a particular language acquisition at a certain time of their formal schooling is not a deficit. That's not, God does not see them that way, but their full linguistic repertoire is a part of what God has gifted them with. And that creating spaces in in schools and in classes where students can really tap into that is a way in which that we can encourage students to use all the gifts in which God has gifted our students with and gifted multilingual learners with. And so I think it starts with that, changing the deficit framing of who our students are and thinking about them from an asset-based perspective, which really embraces that we are made in the image of God, that all of us bilingual, multilingual learners are created in the image of God, and all of the languages that that we're connected to, that we speak at home and that we speak in more formal settings, that these are all part of who God has created us to be and to be able to engage with, and that one is not better than the other, although in some social situations one might have more power than the other, but these are all aspects of identity which are core to how we are created in the image of God. And so that's really important to me as I think about the importance of translanguaging, and also thinking about spaces in which you shared a little bit in my bio is I've thought a little bit about what humanizing pedagogies might look like, especially for multilingual learners, and to create space. Translanguaging, again, the stance which orients how a classroom is set up, is it orients multilingual learners as experts that have all these rich funds of knowledge, God-given funds of knowledge that they can share in the classroom, that these are all positive and these are all affirming things about a person's identity. To be able to say that those aren't valued or welcome, that can be dehumanizing in some ways, because that's such a core part of who you are, how you communicate. And when you say that that's not important or valued, that can really work against what the type of classroom community that you would like to set up. And so when I think about how translanguaging can be a humanizing pedagogy, it allows students to bring their whole selves, all of themselves. It breaks down the home, school divide quite a little bit, or the parents, the parents, and that the language that's spoken at home is something that's of value and not something that you should be ashamed of or whatnot. But it's welcomed in the classroom and it's embraced. And I think it is a humanizing pedagogy in that students can bring their whole selves and not just a part of themselves. And, I went through public schools. I grew up in Chicago and I moved to Southern California, and I've had a lot of exposure to different types of K-12, P-12 school settings and then my own student experience navigating schools as a learner, I think there were often times where I was ashamed of my own identity and I had to hide, certain aspects of my identity because they weren't welcomed and they were different and they weren't included as a part of like sort of what was dominant, what was considered normal. And so I look back at that and that really pains me when I think about that. It didn't have to be that way. And so to your original question, I know I'm going a little bit all over the place, thinking about how faith is connected to this. I think it really stems from this deep belief that we are created in the image of God and language is a core part of who we are. And that is something that I would hope, and when I'm thinking about future classrooms and the students in which I'm working with, that they would work towards cultivating spaces in which all of their students can be embraced and bring their whole selves into their classrooms.
That's really well put. As you were talking about this humanizing education, again, I was drawing parallels or connections to my field. So you mentioned that humanizing education views the student as an expert, right? As an expert of their culture. And in my field, the traditional method of research has been the researcher goes to the community and then takes what the researchers wants from them, right? By doing like a survey or an experiment. But I think a contrasting methodology has been something that we call community participatory research, where participants are actually actively giving feedback. Participants are involved in designing the study, coming up with the research questions, and in that sense, it makes the process so much richer and also is a very humanizing process that allows the whole self to be recognized and the expertise of the community to be recognized. So I was making that connection. And then your point about how just our education system is set up in a way where those who are not part of the mainstream culture might feel marginalized, might feel like their whole self is not valued, makes me think about how, as Christians, we're called to actively work on these structures that go against humanizing people, go against the image of God, and it reflected in people, and how you're highlighting that example through your experiences in education. I know that you have experience teaching at a larger public institution, and then you transitioned to SPU, which is a private liberal arts Christian institution. Many of my listeners are interested in Christian higher ed, and I'm always interested in folks who have experience in both a secular setting and a Christian setting, and how that transition or those experiences have looked like for you. So I know that's a very broad question, but can you speak to maybe one aspect that has been maybe rewarding and maybe an aspect that has been challenging when you transition to a Christian higher education institution?
So I've been involved in the work of teacher ed, like you shared, in several different contexts, but probably for a little over 10 years or so, including sort of when I was in graduate school working in teacher ed programs, and then spent 5 years at a large public institution, and then just shy of 2.5 years ago, I joined the faculty at SPU. And it's been really interesting. It's been an interesting shift. Overall, the content and the area of expertise in which has not shifted all that much. I'm still teaching similar courses that are focused on elementary, early childhood, TESL-Bilingual Education courses. What I have found here at SPU is, and honestly, it's been challenging because I am not used to being encouraged, and also for it to be normative, to be so explicit about my faith. And so I'll rewind a little bit to your question just a few minutes ago about the connection between translanguaging and faith. I think for me, faith is my personal faith has always been a very, very important of why I think the work of preparing future teachers is critical, and preparing them in ways that work towards culturally sustaining practices and setting up classrooms and environments where, as we just discussed, where students can bring their whole selves, all of themselves, into the classroom. That wasn't my experience growing up in school. There's so much research and scholarship on culturally relevant, culturally sustaining teaching. We want our schools and our classrooms now to be spaces where our students that come from marginalized backgrounds feel welcome, feel seen, see themselves in the books that they're reading, see themselves in what they're learning, that it's not just someone else's knowledge that's being passed down to them, but they're a part of the classroom community where they feel like they belong in schools. And for me, when I've had to write my philosophy of education, when I've had to go through exercises of why I do what I do, not just for the tenure process, but also just for me, it's important for me to reflect often about why I'm doing this and why I think this matters. In fact, all of my syllabi include Micah 6:8 about as a main sort of justification of why I think conversations around justice, especially in our context, are important and are critical, and that it's not absent from our faith. It's in fact it's very integrated into who we are as believers, is to pursue justice in all the work that we do. And in our context, the work that we do is in the classroom with students. And what does it look like to pursue justice, to promote equity and belonging and inclusion in the classroom? It is to practice a lot of these translanguaging practices or a lot of these culturally sustaining practices. That it's not just a theoretical, in my head, I value these things, but we can translate these into things that are activities, into strategies, into ways in which we engage our students. And so faith is a really critical part of that. And so being at SPU, that was really a shift to be very explicit about that. Not that faith is new to me. I grew up in a Korean Presbyterian church. My dad is a now retired Korean pastor, and I've been going to church all my life. And my faith, my personal faith, is a really important part of why I do what I do. But being at a small Christian liberal arts college, in fact, it's the first time where I've been very encouraged to be very explicit and articulate how my faith
Right.
actually orients and guides a lot of the decisions that I make and why I teach the way that I do and what we're teaching. And so that's been different and, to be honest, challenging, because for so long I've not been in that space where I've had to
Right.
articulate that very explicitly. In fact, if anything, being in some more sort of secular, and I'm putting that in air quotes, public spaces, that hasn't been encouraged. If anything, it's encouraged to disconnect some of the more personal faith pieces and just more personal pieces of who you are when it comes to your work. And so I found that's been the sort of primary difference that has been difficult in some ways and different just in adjusting to being in a space that's encourages much more explicit sort of faith integration and the articulation of how the faith integrates with the content in which you're teaching. So that's been I think, primary challenge. One of the things that I have loved being at a small liberal arts college, I don't know that this is specific to, I don't know if it's specific to SPU because this is the only context in which I'm familiar with, but I have the fact that we are a small liberal arts college, and my class sizes often have less than 20 students, actually 20, 25. My Asian American Voices, that was the largest class that I've had at SPU in the last few years, and that was still 25. But the smaller class size and the culture of care that is present in other spaces, and I think when I was working at the larger public institution, I cared for my students. I deeply cared for my students. In fact, that's a core tenet of culturally sustaining teaching, is to know your students, to care for them. But I think at SPU I wonder at other Christian, smaller liberal arts institutions, that culture of care is really encouraged top down, in ways in which are not explicitly stated, are not a part of the ethos, not a part of the organizational culture in perhaps like larger regional institutions. All of the faculty that I engage with at SPU, we deeply care about our students. We care about their well-being, we care about their wholeness, we care about their health, and not just their success in our class. Again, drawing on some of the work that I've done on humanizing pedagogies in the past, I wrote a paper with one of my students at the former institution that I used to work at during the pandemic. And one of the constructs that we were drawing on, based on our experiences, it was a dual ethnography. So we were in dialogue with one another, and we were debriefing basically our experience as teacher and learner during the COVID pandemic. In our dialogue, one of the sort of constructs that came up was this idea of care. And I came across Valenzuela's work about critical care, and she talks about two different types of care: authentic and aesthetic. And authentic care is that care for the whole being, and not just about what's happening in the classroom. Whereas aesthetic care is really just care about performance and academic success, about that what's happening in that classroom domain and not about what's happening outside of just whether they're getting an A or a B in the class. And that distinction was really helpful for me. And that comes from her research with Latino households years ago. But I found that sort of distinction and that definition really helpful. And that came out of our time during the pandemic as we were debriefing our experiences and our responses during the pandemic, which were appropriate. And oftentimes she felt that were inappropriate or just less than what she had hoped for or needed in that time. And so my experience at SPU, I feel like that sort of authentic care for our students is encouraged, it's valued, it's welcomed, and that's a part of who we are and our identity, even as faculty, that matters. And not that that didn't matter per se, but it wasn't explicitly articulated in my previous institution where I worked. And so that's been really refreshing, honestly, to be at SPU that I have found. And that's all tied to why we care, right? Our faith guides us in that, orients us towards the importance of really caring for our students. And so being at a small liberal arts institution, to your question, I think that has been one of the wonderful ways I've embraced being at SPU. I really love that that's a part of who we are and our identity as we work. And I'm growing in ways in which that I can, articulate more clearly that connection between the faith integration and how it connects to the things that I'm really passionate about around belonging and diversity, equity, and inclusion and why it matters. And so while it's been challenging because it was such a shift from my previous work situation, it's been really good for me to also have the opportunities to reflect on how does my faith integrate with this? Why does my faith matter in this situation, in this classroom, and how I engage my students and how I engage my work? I know it's a formal part of like the tenure process and all of those things, but I do appreciate the opportunity to reflect. I think it really is important.
And we all do it so differently, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
that when we think about how we integrate our Christian faith into the classroom, I'm struck by the diversity of pedagogical approaches and those who are much more explicit in their approach, like praying with students, and then those who are much more, I guess, implicit, if you will, with their Christian faith integration. And so, as always, really appreciate hearing from you regarding how you think about this. And that authentic versus aesthetic distinction is so important and makes me repent of my own sort of, sometimes with the excuse of how busy I am, I tend to lean more towards the aesthetic part of caring for my students, depending on like when you catch me. But it makes me really examine how I see things when it comes to caring for my students and how we're really called to be authentic carers for our students. Grace, I have a couple of questions that I ask all my guests. And the first question that I ask all my guests is, if you had one advice for new faculty or advanced graduate student who might be interested in Christian higher education, what might it be? If you could give them one concrete advice, what advice would you give them?
This is a great question. One thing that I really appreciated when I was finishing grad school, when I was an advanced graduate student myself, my mentor, who looks very different than me, my advisor, he's an older white male. We come from very different places, histories, stories, very different experiences, but he was a wonderful academic mentor and advisor to me, still is. He encouraged me, and in fact, he set up conversations where I could meet other faculty that were at our institution that I perhaps I didn't run into every day. And so he facilitated a lot of those conversations where he helped me have a lunch date with a particular one of his colleagues that was a mother teaching at an R1 institution, just for me to get a glimpse of what her life looked like. When I was in grad school, I had two young babies at the time. They're now teenagers. It's hard to believe, but just so that I could get a glimpse of what life looks like at an R1 institution while you're mothering and parenting and life. And she and my advisor also introduced me to another person that had a very different experience as well. And that I found to be really, really beneficial as I was wrapping up my graduate program, is just to listen and hear and just glean and get some stories from other folks, to hear about their experiences, about how they were navigating some similar challenges that I was navigating, motherhood and academia and all the things that come with academia, teaching, service, and scholarship, and hear about like things that aren't necessarily the most glamorous, or the things that that aren't more
Mm-hmm.
visible, most visible or clear, just to kind of hear their own stories, and their narratives was really beneficial to me. So if I would give any advice, is I would just listen and try to hear and listen to other people's stories and experiences, and take what you can, leave what isn't relevant, and learn from other people's experiences that may have walked in similar shoes before you, or maybe different completely, but also learn from other folks that have experience and that you can benefit from. I really benefited from, and I appreciated my mentor realizing his limits of his own expertise. Like, he shared with me all that he could. And so it's like, okay, I want Grace to learn
Right.
from other folks too, before she makes that next sort of big leap into the next big thing. And so that was really helpful. I recognized his humility too, and realizing that he didn't know it all. And he didn't think that, like, his track was very different than the track that I would probably
Right.
flourish on. And so I appreciate just that humility in that. And so again, I would encourage folks to just get to know people, learn people's stories, hear people's stories, and have that sort of curious, like we talked a little bit earlier about that position yourself as curious and as a learner in different circumstances, even as you're entering as a faculty member or an expert, learn from others. I really appreciate, even though I came to SPU as some years of experience, I wasn't completely new faculty, but I did
Right.
appreciate that I was assigned a mentor, and getting to know her that the first year was really a lovely experience. And again, she comes from a very different background than I do, different discipline, different area of expertise, but just hearing someone else's story and then having someone to be able to share about, like, is this normal that I'm experiencing this? Having that was really affirming and validating, and helpful in a lot of ways.
Mm.
If your institution provides affinity spaces or groups and where other new career faculty can get together, or even I've really benefited from racialized affinity spaces. There have been times at SPU and also at my previous institution where I've met with other Asian American faculty. Those spaces have been really life-giving for me in just surviving, to be honest, at times in the academy when there have been moments where it's like, I don't know that I can continue with some of these shenanigans, but finding spaces like that have been really wonderful. So I would encourage new career faculty to search out mentoring relationships, opportunities, affinity spaces, places in which they can form community, camaraderie, and support. And there's some common themes in what we're talking about where folks can bring their whole selves, and I think I've appreciated and I've
Yeah.
been able to thrive, not just survive, in some of the spaces in which I've worked because of some of those safe spaces where I can bring my whole self, where I can bring important aspects of my identity to my work.
Yeah. Great advice about the importance of making connections, including mentors who might be able to speak into areas that your current mentor might not be able to speak into. My last question, I'm going to cheat and give it as a two-parter. The first part is, without knowing who my next guest is, so I don't know off the top of my head who my next guest is, what question might you throw at them? What question, it can be a fun one, it can be a super difficult one, but what question might we ask our next guest? And then I've also been told that I should actually ask these questions. So for you, Grace, a previous guest asked, what intentional change have you made in your own teaching practices? That's very recent. So recent change in a teaching practice. And why did you make that change? So that's the question that a previous guest asked.
That's a great question, and I'm glad
Yeah.
folks have encouraged you to ask those
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
So I'll cheat a little bit too and answer the
Yeah.
first question. I'm borrowing. I'm not necessarily
Yeah.
cheating, and I'll credit the source. But I listen to a
Yeah.
lot of podcasts, on my commute in to work or walking. And one of the podcasts I listen to regularly, the host is Jen Hatmaker, and she ends every podcast conversation with actually a question she asks all of her guests that she borrowed from somebody else, from Barbara Brown Taylor.
Mm.
So the question originates with her, and the question is simple, but is, what is saving your life right now? And I love that question. In fact, I ask that question to my students. It's one of the prompts that I have them complete when they're making their name tents on the first day of school, and we'll share those. And you get a whole array of different types of responses to that, which I love, and it helps me get to know students better and I love the question when it's asked on that podcast because you get to sometimes see a different
Yeah.
aspect or perspective of the interviewee that perhaps wasn't shared during the whole interview. So I love that question. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm passing on, which I'm borrowing from Jen
Yeah.
Hatmaker, who borrowed it from
Yeah.
Barbara Brown Taylor.
Yeah.
What is you're saving your life right now? And then the teaching move that I have put into practice or that I'm going that recently.
That you recently actually put into practice. Something you changed in teaching, and why did you make that change?
I made a lot of changes and moves during the pandemic that were at the time a result and a response to a lot of trauma that my students were experiencing. And so I was and these aren't new ideas that I came up with. I was really drawing on expertise online, other faculty that were sharing what they were doing in order to address some of the trauma and experiences that not only their students were experiencing, but as faculty, we were all experiencing.
Right.
And so I've made some shifts during the pandemic that I've also just continued to implement in my current classes that to intentionally just kind of address and try to help alleviate some anxiety and some just external pressures that students already feel. So small moves like
Right.
I take late work. I don't penalize students for turning things on that don't come in on at the target. All of my deadlines, I call them targets, and so I don't penalize or take away any points. That's just I've really thought about my grading practices quite a bit. I like to have a lot of low stakes activities or assignments during the classroom. Part of my core teaching philosophy is to give students multiple opportunities for success. And so students have, if they turn something in that perhaps doesn't quite meet the standards or objectives by the target time, I'll give them feedback and they can, address the feedback and turn it around and turn it in. I don't penalize them or take away any points for that. So I'm pretty generous in terms of how I accept assignments and things like that. And I mean, I guess that's one example of something that now it's been a few years, but I used to be much more strict and would penalize students
Right.
for not turning things on time or even for attendance policy. I've become a lot more generous. One thing, it sounds like this interview is going to make me sound like I'm on social media all of the time, but way back when, during the pandemic, I came across this quote on Twitter and it has stayed with me. Twitter is now X, or I don't know what it is now, but this person tweeted out that grace isn't transactional. And she said this in the context of, sometimes even as educators, we require students to be able to explain or justify why they weren't able to come to class or why they weren't able to turn something in late, or there has to be some sort of exchange of information, or they have to be deserving. Their excuse has to merit why they weren't able to turn something in on
Right.
time and therefore not be penalized and all this stuff. And all of that just blew up for me during the pandemic, where it just stopped making sense. And that line, that grace isn't transactional, has obviously, my name is Grace, but I thought about that in a lot of ways and I've taken that to heart. And that is something that I think about in my own teaching is, am I extending grace regularly? Are they, to the question about how am I integrating faith, is like, are they seeing or are they experiencing grace, which is what is so just transformational and awesome about the gospel, right? Is that, grace is undeserved merit or favor from God. It doesn't require any sense of like, you have to do this in order to get this. There's
Right.
none of that having to prove for that. And so that actually trying to be a person of grace and then to model that and actually have students experience that as a learner in the classroom, that has stayed with me. And to be honest, it wasn't until the pandemic where I really started thinking hard about some of those ideas. And now post-pandemic, those have stayed with me in the class. So that idea of that, grace isn't transactional. I try to think quite a bit about that, not just in my grading practices, but also how I engage with the students sort of day to day in the classroom of how we experience, how we talk, how we treat one another.
That's a beautiful reminder about grace, and I think a good wrap-up point. Before I hit the stop record button, do you have anything else you would like to share?
I'm just sure, Paul, I have gotten to know you a little bit over this last year, and I really appreciate your work that you are making more visible and sharing with your field and outside of your field as well, and making it accessible, but also the invisible work that I know you do a lot behind the scenes in order to support your students and support your family and support your community and the SBU community. I really appreciate that. And I think it is, you're a wonderful example of one that shows grace to many, many, many folks, and that you do bring your whole self to your work. And I think this podcast is a really beautiful example of that, in being able to. I've listened to some of the other interviews, and I love that you're creating a space where folks can not just tell their story, share their area of expertise or the discipline in which they work, but also bring their whole selves to that. And you do a really lovely job of doing that and modeling that for us academics, in bringing all of who you are to the spaces in which you are. So into the podcast, putting your scholarship out there online, some of the blog posts you write, and then just the teaching and the work that you do at SPU, I really value. My last word is I just really appreciate the invitation to be here. I know teacher education is a little outside of perhaps the natural or the normal sort of domain of some of the conversations that you've had in the past, but I really do appreciate that you're creating a space where we can think about some of these ideas, like translanguaging, that extends beyond just education, right, or linguistics, but that we can think about some of these ideas and think about how I could apply this idea, this theory, and also this pedagogy of translanguaging, perhaps in Christian higher ed, as you mentioned, most of your audience might come from, or other disciplines or other spaces as well. So this podcast is doing a really great job of that. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing.
I truly appreciate that. Your words are very encouraging, and thank you for being a faithful listener as well. And always, and this is not the first time that you've spoken such gracious words of encouragement. So thank you. And I'll just say, and I really mean this, that I really appreciated having you on the episode and learning from you. Every time I talk to you, I feel like we run out of time because there's so much to talk about. And I look forward to future opportunities to continue to engage and maybe even collaborate. So thank you, Grace.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngmin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.